Good afternoon, comrades. Thank you for joining us for this session. Depending on where you are and how you're feeling, it could be considered the graveyard session, but I think most of us are ready and fresh to engage in this particular conversation. Right now, we'll be looking at building or determining the steps towards a UN binding treaty on business and human rights. And I thought it would be cool for us, before we really start the session, to briefly, if comrades are comfortable, to please just switch on their cameras and wave so that we can see each other, because the nice thing is that we're in a Zoom meeting, so we can sort of engage with one another. So just briefly, just switch on your camera so you can just wave. And it's good to see everyone's faces. This is exciting things. Great. Thank you so much, comrades. Oh, fantastic. Well, we've posted on the chat the agenda for the conversation. And just to let comrades know that we are recording this session so that we can be able to share it with others on social media platforms that were not able to join. And just a few technical stuff. Please make sure that your microphone is muted and your video is off after the introductions. Well, the introductions just try now, just so that your video is off so we don't take a lot of bandwidth. And we will have a brief question and answer period at the end. So then just close to the end. So if comrades are comfortable, we'll just raise their hands so that we can be able to take note of you. So that being said, I'd like again to welcome comrades to this session. This session is a third session, a part of a 4-part discussion, which is basically under the overarching topic of no to corporate capture and yes to the right to say no. I think it's been particularly important throughout any form of struggle and throughout any form period for us to start strategizing and thinking about how we're going to be demanding, shaping, and forging, in particular, a different development path for the region and the continent as a whole. So we've decided as different groupings who are part of the Southern African campaign to dismantle corporate power with the People's Dialogue and others to develop a 4-part conversation that encompasses issues in relation to demanding a new way of life and also bringing to the fore how corporations have sort of usurped the space and power of people. The idea of each and every single conversation that we've had and we're going to have is to amplify and resistances, how they look like, and sort of how we can join them. But much more important, not just amplifying resistance, but first to start looking at how we're going to seriously and fully build movement and look at regional solidarity beyond just the confinement of SADC. And one would say how we're thinking of holding each other's hands throughout this process. And then comrades would have seen that in the description for the discussion, we've been stressing that it's been particularly clear that corporations have been able to run rampant and sort of hold our governments by the neck, if you like, demanding for industries to open. And people have been saying in different iterations that extractivism in its whole sense has continued. And our demand for the binding treaty is one of the tools, but we think one of the important tools that can help us curb the sort of the strength of transnational corporations. I have a few comrades here who are going to sort of guide us and unpack the discussion for today. But just to remind comrades again, this is the third discussion in a 4-part discussion. The first one this morning was looking at disaster capitalism with a particular example of the oil spill in Mauritius. And just after that, we also had a discussion led by the African Climate Justice Coalition, looking at how the climate crisis is looking like during the period of COVID-19, but much more in particular, zooming into sort of how the need or the quintessential need for energy has completely changed. So because we've all been technically locked down and movement hasn't happened, sort of the high demand for oil or Brent crude was sort of curbed. So it brought to the fore that we're going to really need to look at determining alternative ways of energy. But comrades will be clear that, of course, when we're thinking about determining alternative ways of energy, the system itself will then determine that only a few people will have energy and the kind of energy that should be put forth. So therefore, then us as the people in resistance, it is our responsibility to make sure that we're shaping and inputting into those narratives so that they're not usurped and taken up by reactionary sort of groupings. So as much as we want renewable energy that is going to hit climate targets, it needs to be socially owned renewable energy. It needs to be energy that the people want, the people are running, and the people are putting forth. Similarly, with this discussion that's happening now, we're moving towards a UN binding treaty on business and human rights, but it should be one that doesn't necessarily happen and is written in the confinements of Geneva, but it should be determined and written in the confinements of each and every site, village, community, and people. So I'm just going to introduce my colleagues and panelists. Today, Erica Mendes will be joining us. Rafael will be joining us also to have a part of the discussion. And how the agenda looks like is that we're going to have a overview of the UN treaty process or the UN treaty itself. Then we're going to be unpacking the main demands of the treaty. And then we're going to move into sort of a contextual discussion of what the treaty means for struggles on the ground, particularly zooming in the Southern African region. And then we're going to be looking at the challenges at the United Nations level around unpacking and pushing and demanding for the treaty. After that, we'll be then talking a little bit about how do we get involved and strengthen mobilization and from a civil society point of view, and for African governments in terms of the treaty itself. And then we're going to be looking at some of the, we're then going to be opening it up for question and answer. And I'm hoping that it's not necessarily just a question and answer, but it's an opportunity for us to debunk, talk about this treaty process, if you like, sort of call the treaty process out for what it is, and to really think of demanding ways in which our voices can be amplified within the treaty. And at the end of the session, comrades, we're also wanting to see if we can pull out particular demands that this session is making so it can input into the SAPSN People's Summit communique. Thanks, I've said a mouthful, and just to introduce myself, I'm Gia and I'm based at the Alternative Information Development Center. Thank you so much for joining us, comrades. I'm going to hand over now to the next speaker, who is Erica.
Hello, everyone. Can you just confirm if you can hear me well?
Yeah.
Good, great. Okay, so thanks a lot, Kia, for the introduction. My name is Erika. I'm from Mozambique, and I'm working at an organization called Justiça Ambiental, and we are also Friends of the Earth Mozambique. I'll try to share my screen because I prepared a small presentation. Let me see if I can do that. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we're aiming to discuss now the process around the UN binding treaty on transnational corporations and human rights. So this is a very important process, and I'll try to give first an overview of what has been the process so far and what actually led to this process, and then I'll present some of the main demands coming from social movements and from civil society in relation to the treaty itself. So why is it important to talk about the architecture of impunity of transnational corporations? So I will not go into much detail, but I just wanted to highlight that transnational corporations in the current neoliberal socioeconomic model, they have managed to gain unprecedented powers. So they rely on an architecture of impunity that allows them to stay in impunity after reckless behavior, crimes against human rights violations, degradation of the environment, and so on. So they have absurd economic powers. They rely on an architecture of trade, which are the trade and investment agreements that give enormous powers to corporations, which actually enable them to sue states if states are implementing or putting forward legislation that could harm their expected profits. they have managed to gain also political power, and their lobby and influence in virtually all decision-making spaces, including international and intergovernmental bodies such as the UN, the World Trade Organization, and so forth. They also have enormous legal powers, which allows them to pay for the super expensive lawyers. And of course, on the other side, the affected communities do not have the capacity or the means to defend themselves in a legal case. They also have enormous social powers, which means they control the media, they manipulate what we think we must do, what we must consume, they control many aspects of human behavior due to their control around issues around consumption and lifestyle. So there are many reasons why we need urgently a UN treaty that would actually hold these corporations accountable for the crimes they've been perpetrating. So here we bring a few examples from the Rana Plaza building in Bangladesh to Nigeria to Brazil, but the list is immense, so I'm just citing a few. So all these corporations, they manage to stay in impunity, and most of the times they just pay just minimal reparations, and they are not actually held accountable for their crimes. So there's a big asymmetry in terms of the international legal system, which makes it, which shows us that there are more than 3,400 free trade, bilateral investment agreements and treaties that protect investments and that protect investors. And they all involve binding legal frameworks, which is, for example, the investor-state dispute settlement. On the other hand, there are no instruments that force TNCs to respect human rights or to respect the environment. So for the past 50 years, the United Nations has tried to establish binding norms for transnational corporations without any success. So until this date, we only have voluntary principles and voluntary guidelines that aim to regulate corporate behavior, but because they are not binding, there's actually no consequences for when these transnational corporations perpetrate these crimes. So on June 26th in 2014, 6 years ago, there was a very historic moment at the UN Human Rights Council. So resolution 269 was voted with 20 votes in favor and 14 votes against. So this resolution 269 created an intergovernmental working group that had the mandate of elaborating a legally binding instrument on transnational corporations and human rights. It's very important to note that this resolution was proposed by, it was a proposal by the governments of Ecuador and South Africa, which not coincidentally are two governments from the global South, where we know that most of the impacts of the activities of transnational corporations occur in the global South. So just to give you an overview of how this voting went, we can see that the 20 votes in favor, the big majority of these countries are countries in the global South, and 10 of 20 of these votes in favor are actually from African countries. On the voting against, we have 14 countries, most of them big powers or countries from Europe. We also have the US, and absolutely no countries from the African continent. In terms of the abstentions, we have 2 countries from Africa, which is Gabon and Sierra Leone. So this division, this geopolitical division, already shows us that there's a great need to regulate big business, especially if we take into account the challenges that countries in the global South are facing in terms of trying to regulate the transnational corporations operating in their countries. So in terms of the participation, there have been 5 sessions so far of the Intergovernmental Working Group. So the first session was in 2015. And we have seen a clear increase of interest in the participation of African states in these intergovernmental working group sessions, which is really positive. So from 10 African countries participating on the first session, on the last session in 2019, last year, we had a total of 26 African countries. And not only they are participating, but some of them are actively contributing and bringing concrete text proposals aiming to strengthen the contents of the treaty. The first three sessions, so on 2015, 16, and 17, the sessions were around discussing what would be the main elements contained in the treaty. So on 2018, the chairmanship of the process, which is Ecuador, published the zero draft. So this zero draft was the basis for the negotiations on this fourth session. After that, on 2019, there was published another draft. So this is the revised draft last year, which was once again negotiated in the 2019 session. And now, very recently, this month, early this month, there was a second revised draft that was published from the chairmanship of Ecuador. We are still a bit unsure in terms of whether there will be a sixth session this year or how it will take place because of the restrictions around COVID, but we'll be talking about that a bit later. So it's very important to say that as civil society, as social movements, as affected peoples, it is very important that we have a strong and effective treaty. So this is not about just having any treaty to regulate transnational corporations and human rights. We know that their absurd powers will actually manage to evade responsibility if we have a weak and evasive treaty. So social movements, affected communities, we've been advocating for concrete text provisions that actually ensure that we have a treaty that reflects the demands on the ground and that actually manages to curb impunity. So the participation of all these social movements and civil society groups and affected peoples has been really crucial in this process from its very beginning. So every year, several movements and organizations from across the globe have been going to Geneva and pressuring their governments, participating in the sessions and bringing concrete text proposals to strengthen the treaty text. This work is not only being done in Geneva, but also, and very importantly, in the capitals, lobbying our governments at national level to ensure that they are prepared to negotiate a strong and effective treaty when they go to the session in Geneva. The global campaign to dismantle corporate power is a network of more than 200 social movements and organizations from different sectors that has been mobilizing around this issue. And we have prepared a concrete treaty proposal, which we call the People's Treaty, that has what we want as a treaty. So this is the blue book that you are seeing here in the photo below. And we've been advocating for concrete demands that we want to see included in the treaty. So I will highlight the 7 main demands that we have been putting forward and that we want to see included in the treaty text. So the first demand would be around the scope of the treaty. So we need a treaty that focuses on transnational corporations. So this is very key because we must ensure that we cover all the complexity and the different aspects that characterize transnational corporations. So we must not have a treaty that covers all business because we cannot treat the small bakery in the corner the same way that we treat major transnational corporations headquartered in some tax haven country operating in the global south. So this is very key, and we've been advocating for this. And unfortunately, the initial draft had a focus on transnational corporations, but now the more recent drafts have lost this focus, and the scope is now applying to all business, which we see as very problematic. The second demand would be that the treaty clearly establishes the primacy of human rights over trade and investment agreements. This is very important given the architecture of trade and commerce that we currently have. So we need the treaty to establish this primacy very clearly. We also need direct legal obligations for corporations. So we don't need extra obligations for states because states already have the responsibility to protect and promote human rights. So if we really want to change the scenario of impunity, we must have a treaty that gives direct and legal obligations for corporations and not only for states. This is not included in the treaty currently, and we believe that this is very crucial in order to have a strong treaty as well. The fourth demand would be the solidarity responsibility of all companies in the global value chain. So what happens often is that the small subsidiary that perpetrated a crime can be sometimes, they can receive a fine or a sanction, but in no way we can get to the mother company that is sometimes headquartered in another global north country. So we must ensure that the treaty covers all the companies, all businesses that are incorporated in the global value chain of the transnational corporations. We must get to the decision makers, we must get to the shareholders, because if they're profiting from these activities, if they're making decisions, then they must also be held accountable. So this is a very key demand. The fifth demand would be that the treaty establishes strong implementation mechanisms. So we've been demanding an international court for transnational corporations where affected peoples could actually put a case against transnational corporations. As a group of Friends of the Earth Africa member groups have actually produced a very concrete proposal on how this tribunal could look like and could function. I could share that if people are interested afterwards. Then the sixth demand would be the rights of affected communities. So we must ensure that the treaty recognizes the moral and legitimate authority of people who have been affected by the activities of transnational corporations. So the treaty must establish the right to reparation, the right to information, the right to access justice, and concrete guarantees of non-repetition of any human rights violations. And finally, the seventh demand is a protection from corporate capture. So we want the whole process, the preparation of the treaty, the negotiation of the treaty, and its implementation to have clear provisions that protect it from corporate capture and from corporate lobbies. So these are the 7 really key demands that we've been advocating for. I hope I didn't go too long, but I'm happy to clarify anything if people are interested, and I'll pass on to Kia now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica, for that. I think it's, I think all the demands being put forth by the networks that we work with are extremely important, but the one that got me way more excited is the ones around the rights of affected communities, because that gives us an opportunity to actually strengthen and amplify the voices of those who are sort of being held and being squeezed by corporations. So I'm just going to come in and talk a little bit about the context in the region and how the treaty connects to struggles on the ground. I think in particularly for us through the Permanent People's Tribunal on the role of transnational corporations in the region, we have collected about 20 different cases from different parts or different countries in the region, which bring into sharp focus what corporate impunity looks like. But much more importantly, it also emphasizes and unpacks what extractivism as a whole unfolds. And we were getting cases against mega agricultural companies. We're getting cases against mining corporations, and also, interesting enough, getting cases that look at how countries and people are being starved out of taxes, sort of looking at illicit financial flows. And what made it, what it highlighted for us was the flavor and the theme of how corporate impunity manifests and looks like in the region, but brought into sharp focus that we having to develop the means in order to tackle this. But the tribunal process emphasized to us that tackling it doesn't need to necessarily again happen in boardrooms. It needs to happen collectively with people's power. And the ideas that we had was to develop the campaign on the right to say no. And the campaign loosely draws from the principles of free, prior, and informed consent, which is found and legislated in different groupings or different things in international law, but one can find free, prior, and informed consent in the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights, and you can also find it in the Declaration of Peasants' Rights. And basically, it just, in essence, speaks to the fact that any form of idea or development that is being put forth needs to happen without any form of coercion of the community that's going to be affected. So we need to be getting the information before the project is being put forth. We need to be getting the information without being forced to do it. But at the end, actually, which is the importance of the right to say no, is the point around consent. We need to be able to say yes and no. And if we're saying yes, we need to determine the parameters in which we're saying yes around. And for us, then, it made it very important that we need to place this particular demand within the treaty itself. Not only does it strengthen the demand for consent rights, but it also strengthens the mechanisms in which the treaty can be able to hold corporations accountable. So our ideas was to place the demand for the right to say no within an article that is an article around prevention. Because if we're saying that affected people not only sit at the table, but can determine how the table will look like, the affected people are then taking power on themselves and actually, in essence, holding corporations accountable, and also our states. Because we find that ever so often, the debates and the discussions around development projects and so on and so forth happen between a particular state and a particular corporation. And the people on the ground in affected communities are not there, and they're not given the opportunity to decide what takes place. And also, we found that, again, is that particular projects and particular things are put forth because of money needs to be made. Communities are, of course, told that there will be jobs for them. So we're left sort of in a corner where we're having to accept things because of, well, we need jobs. But the demand for consent not only gives us the opportunity to be able to say, no, this is actually how we're wanting to shape development. It also gives us an opportunity to determine what it needs to look like and to accept the means in which it needs to take place. So Erica mentioned that about 26 African states took part in the latest session of the Intergovernmental Working Group meeting in last year. And I don't think 26 African states are important. If 26 African states are taking place, it means there's other states and other voices are not in the room, and they're not taking and putting forth the voices of affected people. And we need to thoroughly unpack why particular states are not taking part in the process, or why are they remaining silent. And there are two main themes or main messages that we keep on getting from African states. The first thing is the issues in and around capacity. So they don't understand the issue, they don't have enough resources to take part at a Geneva level. And those are things that we're needing to press and unpack. What do you mean you don't have capacity? So you're not devoting resources to a process in which is going to affect your people directly. Over and above sort of the language of not having capacity, another thing that comes forth and becomes particularly clear is that some states would not want to take part in the process because it's literally going to hit their pockets. And when I look at states and we delve in deep to the people within the states, the people within government, many government officials are within the pockets and in conversations with these corporations. So putting forth and demanding a treaty to curb corporate power then squeezes their pockets, so they don't want to take part in that kind of process. And this is a means, again, for us to come and to push and to say, no. We want a treaty. You need to be taking part. You need to be moving away from the pockets of corporations. And these are the kind of things that we're wanting to stipulate. That being said, right, I think one of the other challenges in which we speak around civil society and organizations is that the biggest challenge is, how do you take something that happens in Geneva? How do you take something that takes place in New York and make sure that it resonates with comrades on the ground? And it is very important for us to start thinking about how we take the demand in relation to holding corporations accountable and linking it with the everyday struggles. We need to be looking at what are the struggles that smallholder farmers are going through, and unpacking that who is actually at the forefront of creating the struggle. And ever so often what you find is that it's a corporation, it's a form of mega business that's pushing and strangling people. So in that sense, then, when we're able to draw those linkages, can we then be able to strengthen the demand for the treaty itself? And like I said, that what we've found is important is not only pushing and demanding for consent rights, but placing the demand for consent rights within the treaty. I will say that there's been a small victory, that in the current draft of the treaty, we do have under prevention, it stipulates that Indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent needs to be respected and taken into account. Our push and demand for the language needs to go further, because we don't want it only to stipulate Indigenous people. It shouldn't be a matter of indigeneity. It should be a matter of those who are affected. And if we're saying those who are affected, it goes beyond just the community, but also zooms in and looks at workers' rights. The demand also for the treaty itself can speak to the issue which I mentioned earlier around illicit financial flows. Because if we're saying and we're unpacking and pushing for the treaty itself, it says that affected people and affected communities can have access to information. And if we push for a binding treaty and we get access to information, ever so often can we then get the books or the accounts of this corporation and see some of the illicit activities they are a part of, and then nip one of the actions in which they're taking part in. So that's it from my side, comrades. That being said, then I'm going to give an opportunity then for Rafa to come in and to talk to us about the challenges at a UN level around the treaty. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to this important and much needed seminar. My name is Rafael Morgantini. I work for SETIM, Swiss-based organization, and we are currently coordinating the work of the global campaign at the UN level in the framework of the treaty process. I was asked to give some inputs about the challenges that we are facing as organizations and movements fighting against corporate power and advocating for a strong and effective treaty. And I would like to speak about two main challenges that we are facing today in our collective efforts to elaborate a treaty on TNCs and human rights at the United Nations. So the first challenge is a global one, a long-term one that we have been dealing with since the beginning of the process, and that we will deal with until the end of it. And that's the balance of power at the international level. As we all know, we are in a critical moment at the international level, not only because of the multidimensional crisis that we're facing, but also because of more and more worrying international conjuncture, characterized in particular by the spread of the far right, of reactionary governments, and of neoliberalism more in general. And it appears clear that this conjuncture has a real and negative impact in intergovernmental processes that depend on the balance of power at the international level. This is especially true in the framework of processes that touch powerful interests as the one of the binding treaty. Especially true for processes that could hinder and tackle the fundamental structure and pillars of the dominant economic system, which is naming corporate power and the whole architecture of impunity behind it as Erika explained before. The fifth session of the working group in October 2019 confirmed on one hand that the process is stable, has stabilized. There is no more questioning of the existence of the process, no more questioning of the legitimacy of the process. Moreover, during the last session, we were able to count on a good participation of countries, in particular also of African countries. But on the other hand, the stabilization of the process and the good participation doesn't mean that we are going towards the adoption of a good, strong, and effective treaty. In fact, the battle on the content of the treaty is still ongoing, and therefore we need to engage with countries and push for our demands, our content proposals, in order to try to win this battle, right? On the contrary, we could see a treaty on TNCs be adopted, but not a treaty, not the treaty that we want and that the affected communities really need. So the challenge is towards which kind of treaty we are going, towards a treaty without this, stripped of the content needed by affected communities. And this is unfortunately the current direction of the process and the current content of the draft treaty, which reflect the positions, which mainly reflect, not completely, but mainly reflect the positions of the countries and entities that do not want to tackle corporate power at its core and do not want to challenge the structure of the system, but just promote cosmetic changes. And this situation reflects, as I said, today's hostile international conjuncture. So in order to change this conjuncture, it is necessary to continue and intensify the mobilization of organizations and social movements at all levels, at the local, national, regional level, and of course international, to push for political changes in this direction. And this is what we have been doing with the global campaign, engaging with governments at the national level, at the international level. And now is really time to intensify this work at all levels all over the world. And this work is especially important in Africa and in the SADC region, because, as Erika explained also, there are some African countries that could have a leading and positive role in this process. The second challenge is more specifically related to the current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic, and is a particular challenge for the upcoming session, negotiating session of the working group in October 2020. And the question here is, will the participation of civil society, social movements, affected communities be ensured in the negotiations? As you can imagine, in the last months, there were many physical restrictions for states, civil society, to get into the UN. Many events have been canceled. Some events have been held virtually, but with many limitations for civil society participation. And due to these limitations, lobby and advocacy work towards state missions has been very difficult and almost compromised. And this is, for us as Global Campaign, as organization movements advocating for the binding treaty, a big problem, as the lobby work, the advocacy work constitute the most important part of our strategy. And because of this whole situation, it is still uncertain how the sixth session of the working group will be held, if it will be held, if it will be postponed, etc. It depends on how the pandemic will evolve and on the decision and directive of the Swiss government for the functioning of the United Nations here in Geneva. But in any case, in the last weeks, the current idea is that we will probably go towards a kind of hybrid negotiations, probably with very limited physical participation in the room, probably only, is not sure, but probably this is how the UN has been working in June, July, only state representatives allowed to be in the room, and possibility for civil society to have some kind of virtual presence, but not clear at which conditions. This means that there is the risk to have a very limited and weak participation of social movements and affected communities in the next session of negotiation. Very few possibility to do effective lobby work in the UN building during the negotiation. And this is, as I said, very problematic because, as we witnessed in the last years and in the last sessions of negotiations, the advocacy and lobby work during the week of negotiation, in the room, in the hallways, etc., has been absolutely key. And this is not true only for civil society, but for states too. In particular, we have witnessed for regional meetings or like-minded groups meetings are for the utmost held in the building, during the negotiation, in the room, in the hallways. I feel that the only countries that are now supporting and pushing for hybrid virtual negotiation are the countries that do not want a binding treaty. So I think that this kind of hybrid virtual negotiation is are very dangerous. And this context is even more worrying since in the last year, and particularly in the October 2019 session, we have witnessed a clear willingness by some countries to limit civil society participation. So this kind of negotiation, again, will profit those states that want to pursue the strategy of limiting our participations. And there is also the risk to open spaces for them to exclude us, and a good excuse not to take into consideration our proposals and claims, and keep alive their attempts at denaturalizing or even killing this process. And finally, also a clear risk to see an acceleration in the strategy that aims at quickly adopting a treaty that doesn't include our claims and proposals as the current draft shows. So we are still waiting for more news on this, is in order to understand how the sixth session will be held. But in any case, it's very important that we assess collectively what we want, if we accept this kind of negotiations, etc., and that we come as soon as possible with a clear position. On this matter. That's it for my side, and I'm open to questions and remarks later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rafa, for that. And this then just gives us a good segue into just the next portion, which is I think for you and for Erica to sort of give you ideas in relation to how can we strengthen the mobilization for civil society and governments towards the sixth session. So it'd be good to get thoughts from you, Rafa, and thoughts from you, Erica, in relation to how do we get our governments to do something? How do we get civil society to make a lot of noise? How do we then oppose the mixed or hybrid sort of session that might be proposed? And what are you thinking could be the best ways to are we picketing outside the Palace of Nations, or are we picketing outside our different departments, and to sort of get an understanding of their mandates in terms of the treaty itself?
Yeah, very quickly, I think that this kind of seminar, this kind of discussion and collective debates are already a way to get involved and strengthen mobilization of civil society within this very important process. We really need to try to duplicate this kind of seminar that are very, very important in other regions, not only in Africa, but in other regions of the world, because with all the challenges and pitfalls of this treaty process, I think it remains an important battleground for the fight against corporate impunity. So one way is duplicate this kind of seminar, to do communication work, information work around the treaty, and try to get more and more organization, social movements, organization involved in this process, and push them not only to be interested, to be active within this kind of seminar, but also to engage with the countries, with the governments, with the ministries of the respective countries, right? And I think it's very important for the advocacy and lobby work towards our governments to have a collective and coordinated action. This is very important in order to articulate the work that we have been doing in Geneva with the states delegation in Geneva, and the advocacy work at the national level. So in this sense, I call upon the organizations that are listening to us to get involved, to take contact with us, with Kia, with me, with Brit, with Erika, in order to see how they can get involved in this process, and to continue this work of coordination, of discussion within the global campaign to dismantle corporate power, in order to try to establish a clear roadmap in order to go towards the sixth session coordinated, united, and with clear positions on the different aspects of the process. I don't know, maybe Erika, you want to add something?
Thanks, Rafa. Yeah, it'd be cool to get Erika's opinions. Like, so for example, Erika, what are you thinking would be ways to get civil society mobilized around civil society and government, and particularly in the African continent, mobilized towards demanding for this treaty?
Yeah, thanks. I agree with Rafa's suggestion so far. So I would just add a few things and emphasize as well some of the things that he mentioned. So I think the national work is very crucial. So there will be nothing happening in Geneva if there's not a mobilization happening in the capitals with the ministries, with the government, and building a movement around the need to regulate big business. So we need to make sure that we involve different sectors in this mobilization. So we need the women movements, the feminist movements, we need the labor unions, we need the environmental justice movements, we need all kinds of sectors to make sure that we bring all our areas of expertise into building the kind of treaty that would actually address the issues of impunity that we're talking about. And above all, we must ensure that we are making our demands based on the demands coming from the ground, from the grassroots level. So it's crucial that we are constantly in dialogue with the people that are at the forefront of these impacts, so that we make sure that we understand exactly how the coal mine from Vale is operating in central Mozambique, in Tete, in order to grab community land, and how could the treaty address that. We must make sure that we understand and that we communicate with the different people affected from extractive industries, from mega dams and all sorts of corporations and mega projects, because this is exactly the complexity of the issue that we must ensure that we are tackling. So ensuring that different sectors from civil society are actually in dialogue around this is very crucial. We must not forget also that we are already in the phase of negotiations around a concrete draft. So this means that we must be able to put together very concrete legal proposals. So this means we must also rely on legal experts, and especially lawyers and legal experts who are also dialing with the affected peoples. So this is very key, so that when we are mobilizing and advocating for a strong treaty, we show that we have clear and concrete text proposals to be contained in the treaty. I also think that it's very important that we constantly bug our governments and send them letters, ask for meetings, try to build their capacity on the issues. So here in Mozambique, we don't have a very good history of interaction with the government, especially some of the most radical and progressive social movements and organizations. But despite that, we started sending letters to our government in 2017 because we understood that the Mozambican government was completely absent from the process of negotiation. So even though we never had a response from them, the truth is they started participating, and they've actually been constantly participating in the sessions since then and actively bringing concrete text proposals. So of course, this will not be the case in every country, and in some cases, there is really no possibility of dialogue with the government. But in the cases that there's this possibility, I think it's important to build some kind of relationship, and this must not happen only in October when the session is about to start. This is important to happen all throughout the year as we show concrete violations that are happening, as we show the legal loopholes, and especially as we emphasize that this treaty would be also a tool for states to regulate these companies and to ensure that they have sovereign powers to regulate in their jurisdiction, to make sure that they are not being sued or even threatened about being sued by an investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. So I think this is very important as well. I think it's also important to build mobilization around the issue and organize webinars, discussions such as this one, as Rafa has mentioned as well. So it's important that we link with other groups and other organizations from other countries so that we understand that this is not a specificity of corporate behavior in Mozambique, for example. We must understand that this is a global pattern, and that these transnational corporations, they're operating in this way because they have managed to understand and implement this architecture of impunity. So it's very important to see the bigger picture. But sometimes it's very challenging, well, especially in countries like Mozambique, where we have so many overlapping crises. It's very difficult sometimes to mobilize around something that seems such a far-reached process, like a UN treaty being discussed in Geneva. So sometimes the mobilization around the need for a UN treaty doesn't necessarily mean that we are constantly talking about the treaty. We must talk about tax exemptions. We must talk about the violations of corporations. We must talk about who is involved in this contracts with the corporations, and all this building capacity at national level around this issue, around the questioning the model of development that most of our countries are pursuing, and the level of benefits that we are awarding to these corporations, I see as being part of this narrative that we must build, that we must actually dismantle the socioeconomic model that we're in, that we must dismantle neoliberal capitalism. And then a UN treaty can be an effective tool in order to curb the impunity that we see nowadays. So there are lots of things that we can do in different levels, using our different areas of expertise. And we've been doing a lot of that in the past few years. So we have lots of platforms that we have been discussing this. We are also part of the Southern Africa campaign that I believe Kia mentioned as well. We have a network of several African organizations who are mobilizing and discussing strategies to engage and pressure our governments to engage on the UN treaty process. So I think it's important that we stay in touch and that we share ideas and build our capacities around the issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica, for emphasizing particular points. I think what's important and in and around what you're saying is basically, in essence, the demand for coming together around the treaty is not necessarily just about pushing for getting the treaty going, but it's actually about strengthening and developing people's power. And it's also, I guess, the treaty itself and the process towards getting the treaty is a stepping stone towards dismantling the current extractivist mode of accumulation. So we shouldn't look at the work of getting this treaty as the end all be all, but actually the process of us coming together, developing demands at a community level and inputting into the treaty is a way for us to strengthen and build our movement and inspire people's sovereignty. So then moving on from here, comrades, it'd be great to hear from comrades who are in the room some comments and questions that you have in relation to this discussion. So we're just going to open it up now for a question and answer period if comrades are comfortable. Please feel free to raise your hand and we'll give you an opportunity to just clearly state something or ask a question that perhaps me, Erica, or Rafa could tackle. All right, comrades, I see one hand right now, so I'm just going to give the floor to Mateus.
Hi there, dear comrades. Mateus here, speaking to you from the garden in Mozambique. I'm glad to be with you all. I'm following the conversation and the discussion with great interest. I would just like to add one point here. I'm part of the Secretariat of Via Campesina. This is not what I want to add, but I'm part of the Secretariat of Via Campesina in Africa, and we as Via Campesina are part of the Stop Corporate Impunity campaign, both at international level and also in this Southern Africa chapter of it, where together with many of us in the room, we are part of the reference group. I wanted just to add one or two more. One action actually would be just to reinforce the issue of that the treaty also is fighting for stipulations or mechanisms that protect the rights of human rights defenders. We know that many of our activists have been persecuted, have been killed, and I wanted just to draw attention also to that point, which is a very important and actually innovative, necessary, and thus quite controversial from the perspective of our opponents in this system. Secondly, that if you are interested in getting in touch with or getting engaged in this, pressuring your government or integrating this discussion into your own work, just please, I'm calling on you to call on us also, because there's a wealth of knowledge, there's a wealth of experience amongst us, and we want to join forces. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthias. I'm just going to hand over then to Marsha.
Thank you very much, comrades. Mine is a question, because I think Rafael and Erica also made the point that this campaign is not an easy campaign, and we know this and what gains have we made, etc. But I was wondering whether it wouldn't be useful for us to see how we can think of taking as a collective some kind of legal action against one or other company, holding them accountable. I don't know if it's been tried. I'm not exactly sure, and maybe the three presenters can comment on this. I was so angry with this oil spill in Mauritius. I was wondering, gosh, can't we, all the movements come together and just take these people to court, and take them on, etc. They're so easy so quickly take African or take the rest of us to court when their rights are violated as corporations? And isn't this something we should consider?
Thank you so much, Comrade Marsha, for that. I'm just gonna give there's another hand here. Comrade Mbadi, would you like to come in, and then we could then answer some questions and comment.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for a very fruitful and enlightening discussion. I'm Bali Lulu. I'm from Swaziland, Eswatini. I was more intrigued by the topic because in the everyday work that we do other than is engaging the UN mechanism as is, but of course it's with the current instruments as they are. But there's always been the gap, especially when you talk to women's rights in the context of Swaziland, them being subsistence farmers or small-scale farmers, and if not that, they are workers in the industrial firms of the country. So what we have been seeing in terms of business is that government is taking an aggressive strategy of bringing in businesses that evict people in rural communities. And it would find out that the current way of addressing or try to raise awareness seems fruitless, or it doesn't yield any kind of results. And as you had shared, when you talk to the UN, to a person in a rural place, it really feels and looks foreign. So my question is, at national level, what are the literal steps, proposals for mobilizing and organizing in a way that they can relate to it? Because on the other hand, if they are the worker, this is their sort of employment, the way they bring food on the table. And if they are small scale farmers, because again, the tricky side of Swaziland, it is a dual system. The rural component of end is ruled by the king with the legislation that is not written down. It's just Swazi law and custom. So if they evict you, they tell you they're evicting you in the land that belongs to the king. So we are in that conflict. So what are the steps at national advocacy, at national level of mobilizing and organizing? That is what I'm interested in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mbadi, for that question. So, Comrades, I think there's two things or 2 points for us to really look at is how do we do a class action sort of case that we take forward against a particular transnational corporation. And I think with the oil spill in Mauritius, one particular company has been brought to the fore, which is Vale, and it's been implicated in different shapes and forms with some cases that we've found. So it'd be interesting to hear what perhaps Rafa or Erica's thoughts are in relation to us putting together our energies and forces and taking these nasty little people to court. And the last question, of course, put by Mbadi is how do we concretely at a national level really see ourselves unfolding and making these demands? So Rafa and Erica, would you like to take either one of those questions?
Yes, I can comment.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Go on. I will speak later then.
Okay. Yes, thanks a lot for very interesting questions. I think this is exactly the purpose of this space, is that we exchange some ideas and we not necessarily have the answers, but I think we can build that together. In the question that Marcia was asking, can we take them to court? I think we can and we must, and some of us have been doing that. Of course, there are limitations because, as we know, there's this international legal loophole, so that you can, for example, here in Mozambique, we've been taking companies to court, but what we do is that we take Vale Mozambique, which is a subsidiary of Vale SA, so we can put Vale Mozambique to court, and we did that. And of course, we know that the processes go on for many, many years. We have a lot of challenges in our judicial system. But I think even that helps us understand how the system is made in order to not actually end this impunity. So we have the complicity of our governments that are not really interested in ending this impunity because of the reasons very well explained by Kia. But I think this is always an avenue that we must pursue and that we must focus on, apart from, of course, other things. There's also regional mechanisms that I think are very interesting, such as the African Commission and the African Court on Human and People's Rights. For example, they have several working groups, and the extractive industries and environment working group is quite interesting, actually. They have some quite progressive statements, and they've actually encouraging African states to participate in the UN treaty process. So we must also use these complaint mechanisms that we have, not only at national level, engaging with our national human rights institutions and taking these corporations to court, but also at the SADC level, at the regional level, at the UN level. So as we do that, we will clearly see the loopholes that prevents the big fish from getting caught on these court cases. And this is exactly the point that takes us to the need for this UN binding treaty. We can also, I think it's quite interesting when we try to think about what could be the steps to build this mobilization at national level. So I think as all the crises are falling upon us, which make it a very difficult time for the region, especially given the recent events last year from the two cyclones that hit Mozambique and other countries. We have a very worrying situation in the north of Mozambique, where we have a violent insurgency in Cabo Delgado, where we also have the gas, multinational companies getting ready to exploit gas. So we have an overlapping crisis. So there are many of us who are working in some of these issues. So it's very important that we start, not start because this is being done already, but that we further explore and build our solidarity in relation to the overlapping of this crisis. So it's really important to see the convergence between the climate justice movement and the ending corporate impunity movement. We must stop, for example, in COVID, we must stop corporate bailouts of extractive industries. So we must, of course, focus on building stronger grassroots movements. We must focus on strengthening labor unions and labor rights. And we must see the intersections between the struggle for labor rights and, for example, the struggle for gender justice. So as we face this crisis, I think apart from all the challenges, this is also an opportunity for us to build this mobilization together, to see the cross-cutting issues, to bring our movements together and ensure that we see the big picture, which is a socioeconomic model that is not working for the people and that depends on the exploitation of nature, of workers, and of women. So I think building solidarity and joining forces is really important. Thank you.
Thanks, Erica. Rafa, would you like to come in?
Yeah, very quickly. Yes, I agree with Erica. Legal actions at the national level, regional levels are possible and should be continued, should be promoted. Social movements, organizations should try to bring TNCs to court, because we have to occupy the field. We have to speak out about corporate crimes, and because very simply silence is not an option, right? But on the other hand, we have to be realistic, and we have to acknowledge that it is very complicated to hold corporations accountable with the current national legislations, because exactly because of that same legal and economic versatility of corporations, the complex structures, and the whole architecture of impunity that they benefit from, that we have been discussing here. But on the other hand, I think that the fact that it is nowadays very complicated to hold corporations accountable, to make them pay for their crimes, this is an argument that we can use in our actions, in our communication, and an argument that we can use for our advocacy work and efforts for the elaboration of strong binding legal frameworks in order to try to create the conditions, the good conditions, effective conditions to hold them accountable and to ensure access to justice for affected communities. And the second thing I wanted to add, that speaking about legal initiative, another possibility, another important way of tackling corporate power through legal initiatives is the elaboration of local, national, or regional legislations in order to tackle corporate power and corporate impunity. There are nowadays in many countries, for example, in Switzerland, where I live, there is a popular initiatives that is aiming at elaborating a national legal framework in order to responsibilize, to hold Swiss TNCs accountable when they violate human rights, environmental rights, labor rights abroad. So I think this is also an important legal initiative that we as movements and organizations and that we should be promoting in our countries, in our regions, because it's a kind of I think this kind of more local national initiative are absolutely complementary to the international fight for the binding treaty. So there are many examples around the world about national and regional initiatives, and I think this is also something that we should think about, and where the conditions are favorable to go towards and advocate in favor of this kind of legislations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, comrades. I think the questions put forth by Comrade Merchant particularly speaks to the issue that we're facing right now. So there are different courts that exist, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, but both of these courts actually try either human beings and states. So the transnational corporation itself doesn't necessarily fully exist as a legal entity per se. And ways in which to hold them technically accountable is through, the investor, sort of the investor dispute system, but it's much more of a platform for corporations itself. So I think that when we're demanding for the treaties, when we're also demanding for a particular court to be designed where we affected people can take these issues and try the corporation itself, but maybe we need to be looking at decentralized court actions for one particular company that operates in different regions and take that one company to court in our different locales. So whether it be Parmalat, whether it be Vale, whether it be any form of mining company that operates in the different countries that we live in, we can say that, okay, we're going to take that particular company to court and look at national legislation and regional legislature that can sort of help and strengthen our cases. So the biggest slippery thing is that most of the violations which are taking place are human rights violations, and there isn't a court per se that is listening to human rights violations that are being done by corporations themselves. So I think it would be cool for us to start maybe putting our heads together on how we unfold a decentralized class action, but zooming into one particular company. There's different alliances and groupings that are looking at and zooming into different companies. For example, Shell, which has been doing disgusting things in the Niger Delta, was tried in its home country in the Netherlands, and it was held accountable in the Netherlands. And the communities in and around the Niger Delta were able to access some form of remedy. So, and there's different such and such countries, such and such TNCs that have been held accountable. And maybe we really need to see and look at avenues like that for us to take these corporations to court. But in relation to also with Mbali's question about how do we organize and mobilize nationally, I think, Comrade Bali, is important to look at the different issues that people are facing and really scratching at the nub of the issue and revealing that whoever's creating the challenges that you're facing is actually either the government or big business. And the demand for the treaty is to make sure that governments are not being squeezed by big business. So it's literally saying, looking at how do we impact a big macro issue and link it with the small issues that mamas are facing, that workers are facing, and saying that workers are not able to get a decent and living wage because the company that they're working for is owned by another company, which is taking money out of the country. Smallholder farmers and mamas who are having to sort of bear the brunt of the ecological crisis and any form of economic crisis is actually being caused by states themselves and mega companies that are wanting to make a lot of money. So we can say that we're not able to access water the way we're supposed to access water, not only because of course, the climate crisis, but because a particular mining company is closing up the taps so they can use it for their own extractive practices. And if you continue scratching the surface, you can say that that mining company, which seems like it's a local mining company, isn't really a local mining company. It's owned by other people in the global north. So the demand for wanting a treaty is linked to issues down on the ground. And from there, once we're able to then build the imagination of the mamas we work with, the workers that we work with, comrades in the village and communities, we're then able to then go to particular government departments or ministries and say, what are you saying at a UN level around holding corporations accountable? They're also squeezing you because you're not getting the necessary taxes that you're getting. And they're also crippling us as affected communities. You should be inputting, you should be playing a significant role. And if your minister says they don't have capacity or they don't take part, there's other African states that take part. So Eswatini should be squeezing South Africa. South Africa should be squeezing Namibia. Namibia should be squeezing Mozambique and such like, so that we're able to get our voices into those processes and develop a treaty and a system that holds corporations accountable, dismantles the current mode of accumulation, but much more importantly, develops people's power. So, that being said, we are fast marching towards the end of our session. But before we end, it will be very interesting to get from comrades some of your thoughts in relation to what are the demands and ideas that are coming out from this session that we're wanting to put forth within the People's Summit's communique. I'd be very keen to hear any comments from comrades. Just the last 5 minutes before we close. Please don't be shy, comrades. I think we did say that there's a wealth of knowledge in the room with us. So what are your thoughts in terms of us trying to demand for a UN binding treaty? I mean, Comrade Mersha's question can also be formulated into a demand. We want a court that will be able to try transnational corporations. We want the current treaty draft to not only look at businesses as a whole, but it should be looking at transnational companies. What are some of the other things we're talking about? Are we looking at saying that it shouldn't just be sort of a small issue thing, it should be unifying all our struggles? So the issue of tackling corporations is also the issue of tackling the ecological crisis. Are we saying that we want the rights of nature to be respected and to be seen? Because if nature is seen as an entity itself, then we can definitely try a violate for the disgusting oil spill in Mauritius.
Keep going, keep going.
No, comrades, I'm not developing a manifesto alone. Uh, I'd I'd like to get other comments from comrades. Please feel free to jump in. Please come in, Comrade Matthias.
Okay, I think you're like, I don't feel that you're coming up with a plan yourself. All of the points you mentioned came out in the discussion. So I think it's a matter of just completing those points. And to that, I would say that's kind of going in the line of like the main demands around the binding treaty. We could formulate those into 6 points plus this one. I agree very much with the way you formulated the one on the case with the court. Yeah, I agree with those proposals.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much, Comrade Matthias. Comrade, before then we move to a close, I was hoping if the colleagues who were on the panel would like to say some final remarks before we leave one another. Erica and Rafa, would you like to come in just to say something and say goodbye to comrades?
Yeah, no, just very quickly on my side, it's just again a call upon all the organizations to take action, to come and participate with the global campaign in this collective effort to build a strong and effective binding treaty on TNCs and human rights. And we really need all of you. We really need, as we already said, all the sectors that are working on these issues, that are affected by the activities of TNCs. So my last remark is just a call to all of you to come and struggle with us against corporate power and corporate impunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rafa. Erica?
Yeah, thanks. Just to finish, I think our first and very clear demand would be to SADC and to SADC member states to engage constructively in this process, ensuring that they have their people's interests at the forefront. So I think this is very key. And maybe we could, as you were doing already, we could frame some of what would be the key demands that must be advocated for. So you mentioned the issue of the International Court. I think this is very important, especially given the criticism that revolves around the International Criminal Court in the African continent. And the issue around the scope, it's also very important. And not only is important, and it's a demand from civil society, but several African states have actually defended the scope on transnational corporations, while the European Union and other countries from the global north have actually welcomed this broadening of the scope to all businesses. So this is a clear demand, not only from civil society, but some of the African states involved. So I think we must re-emphasize that. So maybe we can take a few of the demands, and maybe 7 would be too much. I don't know what space we would have in this final communique, but definitely focusing on the issue of the scope and the court and the constructive engagement that actually calls for the government to engage with civil society actors, maybe in the form of national consultations or regional consultations, to make sure that they have a strengthened and informed position on the treaty. Yeah, that would be from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. So I guess then we have a clear way forward and a clear map in relation to the demands that we'll be making. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank comrades for being a part of this discussion. And thank you so much for those that posed questions. And we did post in the chat some of the other avenues where we can continue to connect with one another and some ideas that might come forth. Please, comrades, don't forget that tomorrow we're having the last session of the 4-part discussion, which would be zooming concretely into no to the corporate capture of agriculture. So please join the powerful discussion. We'll be looking at different case studies and examples of how corporations are usurping the space of smallholder farmers who are actually contributing, give or take, 70 to 80% of the food that we eat, not these nasty big corporations. Comrade, thank you so much for joining us. We will have this video available online. It'll be available on Facebook and also be available on YouTube. So if you'd like to look at it again and maybe reference some of it, please feel free then to look out on social media. Thank you so much for joining. Hopefully we'll see each other tomorrow at 1 in the afternoon. Please stay safe. Bye.